All right, everyone, good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Shannon Powell, one of the directors of No Surrender New York. We are so excited to have Eric Boehlert with us tonight.
Hi, and I am Tom Watson, also one of the co-directors of No Surrender. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Eric Boehlert, who is one of the preeminent liberal media critics covering politics in the United States today. We're so glad to have him with us tonight. Eric is the founder and editor of PressRun.media, home of Fearless Media Commentary, a wonderful newsletter and podcast that everyone here should subscribe to. We will drop the link in the chat a couple of times tonight so that you can do just that. It's highly recommended, not just by me, but by Hillary Clinton and many others. Eric is also the author of 3 books, including Bloggers on the Bus, which covered the blogging era of politics in the 2000s, which is really when we became acquainted with each other. It was in some ways a golden era to me of both political and media commentary. And part of me wishes that we were still in it because it was a really interesting time. Eric is also a former staffer for Media Matters, for Salon, for Rolling Stone, and for Billboard. You will also absolutely want to follow him on Twitter for daily, if not hourly, commentary on the state of politics and media in this country. Well, Eric, thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to my favorite topic, although it's a distressing one. There's lots to talk about.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Eric. Just briefly, before we get started, I want to share a little bit about No Surrender New York. We're a new federal PAC that's taking the fight to the radical right here in New York. For the first time in 50 years, believe it or not, New York Democrats control redistricting. The 3 or 4 House seats that Democrats can potentially pick up will be national battlegrounds for the next decade. Winning these seats is going to be crucial to having any hope of keeping control of the House, both now and in the future. So our strategy is to empower voters all around the state and build infrastructure. We can be the firewall that helps prevent a GOP takeover with your help. That's why we're so excited that you're here tonight. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting our work with a donation. We'll have that link in the chat. We love bringing you these events, and that's why we want to get started.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Eric, today is the 1-year anniversary of President Biden and Vice President Harris's swearing in, but let's be as topical as possible. President Biden held a news conference yesterday, by all accounts, the longest in modern presidential history. I know what I thought about how it went, but what's the big thing that jumps out at you at how the press has covered this particular anniversary?
Well, I'll talk real quick about the press conference and then the anniversary, which has much larger problems, I think. You know, the press conference was, well, this is only his second formal press conference. We've heard this for, back to the campaign. Oh, they hide him in the basement. He's so fragile. He can't really be on his own. I think he went extra long on purpose. He took 60 questions. That was, as you said, that was the longest press conference in modern presidential history. The press likes these because they want it to be dramatic. They want it to be entertaining. It turns out, Biden he's kind of a throwback to the no drama Obama approach, which is, effective governance. And frankly, it's not that exciting. There aren't a lot of big headlines. There aren't any gaffes. There aren't any gotcha moments. He talked about policy. He talked about legislation. He talked about foreign affairs for almost 2 hours. As I pointed out on Twitter today, he didn't tell one flat out lie in 2 hours compared to his predecessor. I didn't see any big fact checks by all the major news organizations having to go back and find out what the truth was in all these statements. So I thought it was a success. I don't think anyone watched it and said, gee, he has to do these every 6 weeks. There's other ways to communicate with the country and with voters. But I thought he was excellent. The Washington Post put up this piece today, kind of theater criticism, it went long. He gave long answers. Compared to what we had, I'll take long, boring answers any day of the week. If we talk about the year anniversary, to me, this was building for weeks, if not months. The press is really anxious, I think, to bury Joe Biden after 1 year. And we are really, I think, with the year anniversary, we're kind of at the groupthink cascade of this. Everybody's saying the exact same thing. Everyone's writing the same piece, and it's all doomsday stuff. Yes, Biden's poll numbers are down, 6-7 points in the last half year. Yes, COVID is became back in the headlines and things this year. So, I'll just give you one example. Washington Post, 3,000 word story. Biden's falling poll numbers, his struggling year. I went and counted 43 paragraphs, 3,000 words. There was not one sentence about the 6.4 million jobs created, something no first-year president has ever done since they started keeping records in 1939. No mention of full employment at 3.9%. So to me, particularly with the year anniversary, the press is really, really wed to this narrative. And we can talk about why that might be happening. But when there's a Democrat in the White House, there definitely seems to be a different standard for holding that occupant accountable. And frankly, just real quick, this coverage, this kind of nitpicking doomsday coverage, it reminds me a lot of the Obama coverage in the first year. It's the same kind of reading off the Republican talking points. Everything's a crisis. Everything, the Democrats always being outmaneuvered by Republicans. So we've seen this playbook before. But I think this week that news peg of the 1 year anniversary really allowed all these news outlets and pundits to really take their shot at Joe Biden. And just real quick, I thought he did well responding to that yesterday. The first couple questions were these doom gloom, and he just answered it as someone who's seen this all before. And he said, you know what, I'm going to do my best. We're doing fine. He's not panicked. He's not scared. And I think that's a good sign.
So, Eric, I'm glad you talked about Biden and the economy. So how do you think that the media is mishandling coverage of the economy? I mean, Biden, as you said, has presided over the largest jobs gain in decades, yet we only hear about inflation. Why is this resonating? And how should those of us here tonight think about how to do a better job of pointing this out ourselves?
Well, the good news is, I mean, you don't have to kind of scrounge around and look for good news. I mean, 6.4 million jobs. I mean, that should be a blockbuster billboard. Again, it's funny. I just happened to be doing research on the Obama coverage. Obama's first year or so, the unemployment rate was 9.7%. And people thought, well, we're making our way back. We're at 3.9%. This is historic. I mean, you have to go back to, right after World War II. So the good news is for advocates and people who want to spread a message, there are huge, news items and news nuggets and data points. It's not like we're trying to scrounge around and connect dots that don't exist. This is the real news. But in terms of the economic coverage, and this plays into what I was saying before, the press really decided they liked a particular storyline and they liked a particular narrative. A lot of this started after August and after Afghanistan. I think the press really liked that crisis coverage of August, and then the Afghanistan story ended, and the press kind of looked around and said, well, what else can we create a crisis about? What else can we kind of gin up and turn into doomsday? So they decided the economy, but specifically, they decided inflation, as you said. Traditionally, the metrics you use for judging a president in terms of economy, unemployment, jobs numbers, mortgage rates, home sales, consumer spending, all those metrics were excellent and continue to be excellent. But inflation, because we just had a global pandemic, was quite unusual and quite high. And so what the press did through the fall and the winter, they decided inflation was the economy. That's the only, if you wanted to understand the US economy, you only had to focus on inflation. And frankly, for the news and particularly television news, that's a really simple, compelling story to tell. You interview shoppers, you go to grocery stores, you interview people complaining about how high their bills are. Very simple story to communicate. And so that's the one they really went into. they kind of ran into reality over the Christmas shopping season, the holiday shopping season. The storyline for months was consumers were panicked about inflation. They were at home sitting on their wallets. There was this crisis about inflation. And then the holiday shopping season came along. It turns out they were buying everything in sight. I mean, consumer retail shopping was up 16% over last year. So it didn't really match reality. Consumers, in part thanks to the stimulus bill and the stimulus emergency spending that Biden passed, Americans saved $2.5 trillion this year, which was unmatched. So I think the press, focused in on inflation. It's easy to produce big headlines, and they decided, like I said, that was that's all they had to cover in terms of the economy. Real quick, couple points. Again, job gains used to be the big headline. Oh, this is how the president's doing. This is how the economy is doing, because this is the unemployment numbers. Over the summer, I think it was the July jobs report, almost 1 million new jobs. NBC Nightly News did not cover that story that night. It just simply wasn't important enough. When the U.S. economy added 1 million jobs, but I can tell you, when the inflation numbers came out on a monthly basis, that was usually slotted as the second or third most important story that night. So a real double standard in my mind.
So Eric, speaking of the pandemic,
yeah,
and the way, say, Biden is covered versus how the Republicans have been covered, and frankly, how the radicalism of some of what is almost a pro-COVID policy platform of so many in the Republican Party, by the way, including a lot of Republicans here in New York,
absolutely.
where it has become, where the extremist position has become the normal position for the state GOP,
Right.
and for representatives like Stefanik and Malliotakis and Zeldin and Tenney, who are very radical in their views on this stuff. Yet the media, and we'll probably talk about this multiple times, just believes they're taking a Solomonic position. We'll just split this, and this is one side and this is the other, even during what is clearly a threat to public health.
Yeah.
How did they get here? What's your theory as to why they are covering the pandemic this way? And I'm not sure you have an answer, but how do the rest of us sort of deal with that?
Well, I think it's, I did a column a couple of months ago. I said that, spreading COVID is now the Republican Party's #1 priority.
Yeah.
And that seems like an exaggeration, but when you go through it, it's hard to argue with that. And particularly now, we have the Supreme Court blocking mandates, the state Republican governors doing everything in their power to continue the spread of the pandemic.
Right.
So here's what happened politically. Biden in July 4th weekend gave that speech, said, we're going to declare independence from COVID. The vaccine numbers were looking great. This was pre-Delta. It looked like he was going to absolutely deliver on this vaccination promise, maybe 70, maybe 80% of the country. This thing was going to be over by October. And the Republican Party and the conservative media, I think at that point said, no pun intended, over our dead bodies. And that's when the radical, they'd always been anti-mask, they'd always been anti, lockdown and things like that. But that's when I think a lot of them just became anti-vaccine. And I don't think a lot of people at the January of 2021 thought the Republican Party at the end of the year would essentially be anti-testing and anti-vaccine. But they did it because they were afraid Biden would get success. And so this is a culmination of a couple decades in terms of a radical push within the Republican Party, obviously being fueled by Fox News and others, that a Democratic president cannot have any successes, legislative successes or anything like that. And you would think on paper, well, a pandemic's different, right? This is a public health crisis. We have nearly 1 million dead Americans. This will be different. They're going to set aside partisanship, but they didn't. And I think they feel like this is a success. They look at Biden's polling numbers, which are down. COVID numbers are still high. And honestly, I think they think that is a success. And your point about the press is a good one, because they're so tied to this. Well, let's cover both sides. Democrats have this position on a public health, and Republicans have this position. Let's treat them as the same. Again, if you go back to March of 2020, and if you had said to journalists, not only are we going to be still doing this 2 years, but in 2 years, the Republican Party and the conservative media will be telling people not to take a free, effective, miraculously safe vaccine, the press would have said, no, that's not even possible. Of course, everyone wants to end a pandemic. Of course, we're all in this together. Trump just said so in 2020. But this is where they've ended up, and the press, by definition, just kind of follows them and says, "Oh, okay. Well, if this is the position of the Republican Party, it's our duty to report it, and we'll get quotes from both sides." They don't say this out loud, but one side is anti-pandemic, one side is pro-pandemic. But the press kind of whitewashes that and make it seem like, well, we're having a debate. People disagree, and if people disagree that the pandemic should end, then we should cover it that way. That's the Republican Party position. Who are we to say that's outside of the mainstream? And just real quick, so much of the problem I feel that we have with the press is they are committed to this idea that the Republican Party remains a center-right institution, right? They're the mere opposite of the Democratic Party. Democratic Party is center-left, Republican is center-right. They're both equally honorable, and they're both going to argue the facts and things like that. Obviously, the Republican Party has made a quantum leap into something else entirely, but the press, I think, is just too timid to say so.
Eric, can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that was actually one of my questions. It was, why do these outlets, including liberal ones like the New York Times, normalize what's happening with the GOP? I consider them, an authoritarian extremist movement. And yet it's like, oh, well, that's their position. 1 million people are dead. We had an assault on the Capitol, an attack on our country. Oh, well, Joe Schmo, this is what he thinks. Why is that?
Well, this goes to the fundamentals and how conservatives have been successful over the last 5 decades since Spiro Agnew and liberal media bias was created during the Nixon administration. So the reason the press doesn't call it out is because it's too dangerous. You can't call the Senate Majority Leader a radical. You can't call the House Minority Leader an authoritarian. They're so timid and they're so plugged in to the right-wing pushback that they're very reluctant to call this stuff out. I mean, yes, on the commentary on the pundit side, but it's just drilled into the Beltway press, on the news side and journalist side, that basically no matter what the Republican Party does, it's by definition within the mainstream. And that is how Trump and the Trump Republican Party has completely played the press, because they say, well, if we do it, you have to treat it as serious. You have to treat it as the mainstream. You can't make judgments on us within the news coverage. You have to play it straight. And so that has allowed them to shred the protocols, shred guidelines, kind of shred common sense. And the press is historically nervous about attacks from the right-wing media, about back in the day being called out by Rush Limbaugh, and now nobody wants a segment on Tucker Carlson with their face and their name on it, because it actually can be very dangerous for the target. It also isn't good for your career if you get tagged as kind of in the bag for the Democrats. You want to be savvy and you want to be in the middle and things like that. So there are a lot of different elements at play. And a lot of there's lots of reasons why Republicans I think, are basically able to work the refs and get better coverage or provide worse coverage for Democrats. A quick point, which I've said for years, every Beltway news cycle every morning starts with the same premise, which is what are Republicans angry about today? And everything else springs from that, whether there's a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House. Their kind of faux outrage is able to dictate our news cycles.
I think that's a great point, and leads into what I was going to ask you about. And that is, they are very good, meaning
Yes.
the Republican side, at manufacturing these places of outrage. For example, critical race theory.
Right.
But that's just another in a long line of critical race theories. And the Democratic side, we're terrible at doing that. We would have a hard time messaging free beer in a crowded bar, as I like to say on Twitter. There is a definite difference there. There is, I don't know, a shamelessness, a fearlessness. We tend to hold, we're the good government side. We're going to tell you the truth. We're not going to shade the facts too much. We're going to try to put it forward.
Right.
They're completely shameless, and without a media that's going to say, "Wait a minute, we're not doing that." It just leaves the door wide open to that. And I just don't know if you have any ideas about, how not so much how the Democrats can message, but how the media should deal with this complete onslaught of things like critical race theory.
Yeah, no, the phony outrage is really important, and the press loves it because it's gift wrapped content. They don't have to go find these stories. They arrive in their inbox every morning, every hour, from the RNC or just turning on Fox News. So I think the Beltway press is very receptive to all that. It's a very easy thing to cover. But the point about Democrats is so important, and it just goes to the massive imbalance that we're facing. So we talk about Republican phony outrage, and 9 times out of 10, it's completely phony outrage. So Democrats say, well, I don't want to be in the phony business. I'm not going to make up some scandal. I'm not going to invent some outrage that doesn't exist. And good for them. We don't want to be the party that invents outrage and smears people based on no evidence, the way the Republican Party is. So unfortunately, and I don't think there's any way around it, the Republicans own that. They own that. They're shameless. They are willing to traffic in lies and misinformation. And Democrats aren't. The problem, as you point out, Tom, is there's no reward for being honorable. There's no reward for being honest. As I said, the press loves, phony outrages. It gets people excited. You go demand, responses from Democrats. It puts them on the defensive. It's a whole easy news cycle. The other point I think about Democrats, and hopefully it's changing a little bit, but certainly for decades and maybe a couple generations, Democrat, particularly politicians, and whether it's state houses or certainly in Washington, had this misguided perception the media is on their side. And if we just tell the truth, and if we tell a compelling story, and we're decent and honest, then of course the Washington Post will run with our narrative and tell our story, because the Washington Post has a quote unquote liberal editorial page. And I grew up reading the Washington Post and the New York Times, and these are good, honorable, outlets, and let them do their job. And we're pro-journalism, and that's all true. But New York Times isn't our friend. Ask Bill Clinton, ask Joe Biden, ask Barack Obama, ask a lot of people who've been maligned, ask Hillary Clinton, obviously. So I think there's more sophistication within the Democratic political ranks now, that not only is the press not going to tell your story just because you ask them, but some criticism is helpful too. It's helpful when Democratic officials step forward and say, you got this wrong, this framing is ridiculous, this is that you're just regurgitating Republican talking points. There's a couple of senators who do it really well on Twitter, and I guarantee you, newsrooms are reading that, and it has an impact. So, but yes, Republicans are shameless. And my last quick point, in terms of the conservative infrastructure within the Beltway, they're just drowning in money. I mean, these think tanks and these websites and these podcasts, they have so much money, they don't even know what to do with it. And one of the things they do with it is messaging and misinformation and propaganda and phony outrages. And so there's a whole industry, a very lucrative industry that does nothing but that. And so that's another pretty big disadvantage for Democrats.
Before, Eric, I ask you another question, I just want to mention that if anybody has a question, you can put your question in the Q&A and I will try and get to it here a little bit later. But Eric, I want to go back to this both sidisms, as we call it, that you talked about with the COVID coverage. That happens with a lot of issues. You see that the press giving equal weight to different issues, white supremacy, attacks on civil rights, the demise of democracy, things that shouldn't warrant another equal weight, another side. Why can't the media escape this insistence on both sidisming everything to death?
Yeah, and it really became a problem during the Trump years because we were doing this both sides, and then it became this. I mean, you had a radical, authoritarian, pathological lie. I mean, unlike anything we've ever seen in American politics, and you can't really both sides that. But as a way to create a normalization, it was attempted for 4 years and absolutely drilled into the press coverage for 4 years. And why do they do it? It goes back to my point. For one of the reasons it goes back to my point is just timidity. And so how do we cover this madman in the White House? We can't call him a madman. We can't call him a sociopath. Well, how do we say it's unusual? Well, we'll say, some people say this is an unusual presidency, or some people say, Trump, traffics in falsehoods, and kind of leave it at that. And another super safe way is to do the both sides. And it's basically a cop-out. It's a way to not tell the honest truth about what was, if we're talking about Trump, what was happening in this country. It's a way to kind of be mealy-mouthed about it. And it's a safe way, because the press can step back if they get attacked, by Republicans or the conservatives. Hey, you're being unfair to Trump. The press can say, well, I just presented it as both sides. It's up to everyone else to decide. Trying to obliterate free and fair elections, that's not really there's not two sides to that. And that's going to be the challenge going forward for the next few years, particularly as Trump eyes, another run. That's not something you can kind of dance around. That's not something that can be ignored. I mean, the entire central premise of his reelection campaign is to do away with free and fair elections. So we see some change. I'm very critical, and I'll point out some things that I think are signs of hope, tiny slivers of hope. Trump had scheduled a press conference on January 6th. He was going to tout the big lie and, do it on the anniversary of the insurrection. The day before he canceled it, and the reporting was not enough TV networks were going to carry him live. And, to me, that's a good sign, because a year ago, they obviously, or even 6 months ago, I think they would have carried him live, but we're learning more and more about the insurrection, in part thanks to the January 6th committee. And I think there's at least serious conversations happening at TV news and other places. How do we cover this guy who's dangerous? So that was good to see that press conference never happened, because it would have been bad for everybody.
Great. Go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, can I just have a follow-up? What do you think about the channel, pardon me, the January 6th coverage as a whole, especially, when we're in this next phase with the committee, with all the news coming out of the committee? How do you think the media is handling the coverage of that right now?
Yeah, I think there's good news and bad news. The good news is I think the committee is doing really well. I think they're sitting on a ton of information. I think they're being really smart in terms of how they release it. They keep using Fox News as their angle, releasing these texts from the Fox News host. That generates a lot of media coverage. So, and we're going to see public hearings. So I think the press is very receptive to that because it's all very straightforward information. Republicans don't really have a good response. There isn't really a counter push. They don't really have a good story to tell. So I think Democrats, particularly on the 1-6 committee story, they kind of have the whole landscape to themselves. And I think it's going to be a bigger story this year than a lot of the people in the press think. There's been some great reporting about the insurrection and the conspiracies and the groups involved. I guess the one drawback, it goes back to the Trump coverage. If you read about Trump and he's going to run for 2024. Well, what's his strategy? What's his tactics? How much money is he going to raise? Who's he going to freeze out? Is he battling with DeSantis in Florida? You would think he's just a traditional Republican, powerful candidate. The insurrection almost never is included in coverage about Trump if he wants to run for president. It should be the first or second sentence in every story. I mean, we've never had someone who wants to run for president who led a deadly insurrection. So the insurrection coverage in general is good, but it's being kind of in a silo, and it's not part of the everyday Trump coverage, and it absolutely should be.
Absolutely. That's great. And it is totally siloed. It's almost normalized that here's
Yes.
this guy. Hey, he's going to run again. He's polling at 50%. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
He led an insurrection. Robert E. Lee is polling at 50%. We have a panel of expert questioners that we have assembled tonight, and we are also continuing to grab some questions from the Q&A function and the chat. But I want to first queue up our friend Armando Lorenz, who we both know from many, many Twitter conversations. And so Armando is going to ask our first panelist question. Armando, take it away.
Hey, Eric, how are you? I
Hey,
actually just
Armando.
listening to you, I had about 27 questions come to my head, but I do want to say thanks to No Surrender for doing this and for the work that it's doing. And you should maybe think about a little bit at a local level. What's happened with Democrats is there are a lot of people behind them pushing to not be afraid to do what needs to be done. For example, in redistricting, the legislature rejected the commission here in New York. Well, I'm in Florida, but you know what I mean. And I think they're going to be aggressive in redistricting. That's something new for us. To go back to your beginning, and I noticed you had tweeted about just before you came on, the Aaron Blake analysis of the Biden press conference.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with your point that they're looking for things, but it's interesting to me that the two things that Blake picked out, one was, Biden talked about the uncertainty of what you would do in a response, and that it depended very much on what Putin does in Ukraine. And I said, well, first of all, I reacted to that last night. I like that answer. I think it's important to tell Putin that, number one, as policy, but also as a president. I like a president who tells the truth. He tells it like it is. And the second thing he talked about was that Biden talked about the legitimacy of the 2022 elections. We always talk about 2024, of course, in context of 6. And I do think that they're not getting, there was a bit of a failure here, I think, messaging wise, and always the press makes it difficult on the importance of not just the voting rights pieces, but making sure the mechanics and the procedures at the state level are such. Look, all this is in a way being designed to steal the presidential election in 24, but it's also designed to steal elections in 22. So the question I would say is on 1-6, what do you think on the 1-6 committee, particularly, what do you think, as opposed, how do we pressure the media to cover the 1-6 committee properly would be the question I have. Your newsletter is fantastic. And just so you know, I have a lot of reporter friends. Let me tell you, they don't like being in your column. And they whine to me about it. And they say, that jerk. And I said, listen, try to be better. But what do you think, besides what you do, other
Yeah.
people can do to assist on getting the full picture? And it goes within the context of how you cover Trump, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I always wish I had a better answer for, what can people do, because it's frustrating. We feel ignored. But, I think it's just important to keep up the pressure. And Twitter is a great forum for that. Everybody reads their own tweets. Reporters used to be kind of walled off for the New York Times. They didn't have to interact with the public, and now they do. I pointed to that ray of hope with Trump canceling the press conference because he wasn't going to get enough coverage. So I think we're being heard, but sometimes I totally understand how it feels like we're not. But the option of not doing anything isn't really an option. So we just have to keep up the pressure, and we do it in a factual way. Unlike the conservative attacks on the press, which are usually personal and usually fictional. But to your point about the 1-6 committee, I think the press is really, I think they're keyed in, and I think they want more information. And I think this is a good story, because I don't really think there's a struggle to tell this story. And again, I think part of it is the GOP just has no messaging on this. There is no pushback other than try to, and they're losing in the courts, and now we're getting more documents. I really think this is going to be a bigger story than people think this year. And I think the press this is maybe one of those rare instances where the press is willing and eager to tell this story, because it's all based on fact. And I think the committee is releasing the information in a really interesting and tantalizing way.
Definitely. Thank you, Armando. And now I want to cue up our friend Mark Clapper, who also is a Twitter guy. So we've seen Mark on there a lot. So go ahead, Mark. Fire away.
All right. Thanks, Eric. First time, long time, as they say on sports radio.
Exactly.
I went to journalism school way back when. And it feels like the journalistic standards that I had to really study and learn in my history, law, and ethics class don't exist anymore. And what do you think is the cause? Is it strictly strictly reporters trying to appear balanced and folding themselves into pretzels doing so? Is it just a quest for eyeballs? Is it newsroom cutbacks and there are no editors asking tough questions? Or is it something else?
Yeah, you hit two of the three that popped right into my mind. The first one is there has been a massive brain drain over the last 10 years at newsrooms, and particularly people with experience, and that would be editor positions and people who would have sent stories back and saying, "Are you kidding me? Like, well, the premise of your story, this doesn't make sense, or this headline is off." So I think there's a brain drain, and I think. Yes, clicks and ratings. And, I write about this stuff all the time. People say, well, Trump was good for business and that's why they want him back. I don't think it's that straightforward. I think they do miss the chaos. They do miss the headlines. They do miss the entertainment value. And I think they're trying to drum that up with the Biden administration. So the type of coverage they were doing under Trump, when it kind of made sense because he was a madman and a sociopath, and we had 8 different breaking stories every day. They're trying to replicate that with Biden because they liked that rhythm. They don't want to step back. They don't want to go back and kind of take a breath because, yes, having just said, the business might not be driving it. Look, CNN's ratings are just a disaster, and they're not alone. And the Biden administration is not particularly exciting. There are no scandals. We literally in a year have not had a single serious leak from the West Wing in 12 months. So the drama is just not there. But I think it's I think it's reporters chasing the entertainment value, trying to create drama, trying to, the savvy insiders always think Democrats are being outmaneuvered by Republicans. And I think there's an urge to prove you're not part of the liberal media, prove you're not in the bag for Democrats, and it's easy to do that if you just want to drag the Biden administration and things like that. So I agree. I think the standards are much lower. I read some stories and I read some headlines and and you just shake if you've been doing this a while, you just really shake, and from elite news organizations, and you just wonder who read this, who okayed this. This doesn't really make any sense. And these are supposed to be, the cream of the crop who end up in the Beltway. So again, there's still some obviously great journalism. I hit the New York Times all the time, and I always say, outside of the DC bureau, it's an amazing newspaper. It really is. Business, sports, science, amazing, cultural. But there's something wrong with that DC bureau, and what's wrong is the mindset and the culture and the vibe.
Definitely true. I'd like to introduce our third panelist, another friend of No Surrender New York, Margaret Bradbury. Margaret, you're up.
Hi, thank you, Eric, so much for this great event. So, you just talked about what the elite media is doing and, echoing some of the comments that people have had in the chat. I really wanted to talk about tactics, and especially local tactics.
Sure.
So here in Westchester, and a bunch of us here from Westchester, a lot of us get our local news from like Channel 12, LoHUD, some even from smaller organizations. And our region actually stands to do really well from the infrastructure bill successes. So my question to you, speaking to the activists on the line, how do we best influence our local media organizations so that they effectively report a fact-based narrative of Biden's successes? And especially, as you know, competence and telling the truth is just a whole lot less riveting than the theater of the authoritarian macabre that we, just endured.
Great question. Obviously, talk about the brain drain. Local media is obviously, as everyone knows, has been decimated. Where I live, I used to be, lots of robust local newspapers covering my local community, and it doesn't exist anymore. I don't know who won the local high school basketball game because it doesn't exist. So that's the troubling side. I think it's also an upside because if you go to the local media with a compelling factual story, I don't want to say prepackaged in a bad way or manipulative way, they're going to be anxious for that. They want, thank you. We need content, and again, I mean that in a good way. So I think they're probably even more receptive to local activists saying, hey, this is a compelling story. I have, I can line you up with a couple of people to talk to. Here's the background. It's a pretty simple story to tell. It has an impact on our community and things like that. So I think if people are professional, make life easy for the local media outlets, they'll be happy. They'll be more happy to tell your story than they might have been a few years ago when they had a much larger staff and long meetings for rundown because they had too much content. I think there's probably a real opportunity if you help make their job easier. I think they would appreciate that.
Eric, we have a few questions from the Q&A, but briefly, I want to ask you one question before we get to that about the media's coverage of Vice President Harris.
Yeah.
How do you view the media's coverage of Vice President Harris? I will let you take it from there.
No, it's very interesting. First woman vice president, first person vice president of color, and lo and behold, the Beltway media created a whole new way to cover the vice president. We've never seen coverage like Harris has gotten under a microscope, 4 or 5 months into her first term. The Atlantic in June, she'd been vice president 3 months, did this big story about her vice presidency was a failure. It's just unheard of. And, all these stories about, there's poor communication between the vice president and the West Wing. And you can go back. I did a piece about how white male vice presidents, their coverage in their first year was entirely different than Kamala Harris. Nobody cared about, the flow of Mike Pence's emails to the West Wing, his first year in office. I went back and I looked at, the Quayle coverage and the Pence coverage and the Biden coverage, and they were in their first year, they were all basically cheered as, they're going to reinvent the vice presidency, and they have unexpected amount of, of influence in the White House, very cheery stuff for the new vice president. Kamala Harris not only didn't get a honeymoon, they just went after her from day one. And so it's almost impossible for me to look at that and not say she's being held to an obvious double standard. And then you start wondering why, and what's different about her, and those answers are pretty clear too. So I think it's been really unfair in terms of her coverage. There's nothing wrong with critical coverage of any sitting, public official, Democrat or Republican, but the microscope she was put under, internal staff machinations, no other vice president in their first year ever faced that kind of scrutiny.
And it's endless. It's just story after story after
Yeah.
story. It's not
They
like
like
a one-off story either.
Yeah, no, it's a content pipeline, so they're just going to keep doing it.
Right. The media also seems to be in lockstep with describing the Biden agenda as far left, but somehow Trump's agenda isn't far right. They never
Right.
say that. And so that kind of leads me to a question from Ann Field that was in the Q&A about a Washington Post story about parent activists at school board meetings. And this article never mentioned the right-wing extremist agenda behind these activists at the school board meetings.
Yeah.
And also she wants to know about how they turned on the Biden administration during Afghanistan, to cover inflation. You talked about some of these things, but can you just comment about why this is happening and why there is this bias?
Well, and I'll be happy to talk real quick about Afghanistan and the education. The larger in terms of why, I mean, if I had to float a theory, I don't think the press wants necessarily Trump to be president again. I think they want to keep the playing field even until he gets back. I think they feel like their job is to keep Biden in check, in place, and make life difficult for him. And then there will be this really exciting, entertaining campaign. Because that's kind of how the press views this stuff. And no, they don't see it as an attack on democracy and authoritarian rise in America. I think a lot of see him as, oh, that'll be great, and so it's a theory and it's just a hunch. I don't have any proof. I don't have any, interviews with journalists or emails, but I think they really feel like, let's keep this close. And then what happens, and it could be really exciting. And in terms of Afghanistan, it's interesting. Right before that, there was some chatter in the Beltway press about how reporters were just really kind of fed up with the Biden White House because it was boring. And, they weren't getting on TV as much. Nobody's going to get a book deal out of this administration. I can tell you, maybe one or two people, not 28 book deals like Trump. And so there was already this simmering discontent with, we don't want like effective governance. That's not interesting. That's not, that's not going to help my career. And then Afghanistan kind of opened the door, I think, for this kind of crisis coverage and, nonstop, all caps headlines and things like this, even though they got the Afghanistan story wrong. I mean, CNN's, reporter on the ground famously tweeted out that, there's no way they're going to ever airlift 50,000 people out of here. And they ended up airlifting 125,000 people, and nobody ever apologized for that. But to me, Afghanistan changed everything because, as I said earlier, the press kind of looked around and said, oh, we can do crisis with Obama. Okay, yeah, we can get back to that rhythm that we kind of had with Trump, and let's pretend everything is chaos.
Right. And that really feeds into the herd mentality. I mean, I know because I was a working journalist in Washington, and there is a herd mentality that goes with the press corps. That's what they do. So one of the questions that people have, they really want to know what should people at home, Democrats, independents, people who are concerned about this kind of bias, and what do they do? What's the answer?
Well, a couple of things. Stay vigilant and understand what you're reading and read between the lines. But in terms of pushback, conservatives are very hands-on. They reach out to the press, they reach out to reporters. They usually do it in an angry harangue. But if you do reach out to reporters, if you do reach out to news organizations, they might not respond, but they know that presence is out there. And we have to be out there. Otherwise, we're just leaving everything entirely to the other side. So in the old days, you'd write a letter to the editor. Now, there are other things, whether comments or tweets or getting in touch with reporters and editors or producers and things like that. So I know it feels sometimes helpless. And I know it feels like, things aren't changing, or they keep making the same mistakes over and over. But the press is very thin-skinned, luckily. I found reporters and journalists, and they don't like being called out, and they don't like their work being questioned. And so they hear, even if it doesn't seem like they hear and they see when their work is criticized, particularly, I think, from a factual and not in a screaming and yelling kind of way.
One thing that we really haven't touched upon, Eric, is the right-wing media. It's beyond Fox News now. It used to just be Fox News, and now it's, all of these other outlets, including station groups like Sinclair.
Yeah.
How do you see this changing, the coverage of the presidency here in the next, 3 years?
Well, I don't know why these people are in the White House press briefing room, and that to me includes Fox News. Right after the election, I wrote a column and I said, the Biden White House should kick Fox News out of the press briefing room. They're not a news organization, and my God, it's only become more apparent in the last 12 months. And we talked about COVID; they are just absolutely hands down pro-COVID. But why is OAN? Why is Newsmax? Why are these fringe outlets asking these ridiculous questions and wasting people's time in the White House? And I think it just leads to the normalization. So either the Biden White House or the White House Correspondents Association, there used to be standards in terms of that. But in terms of what it's going to mean, I actually think it's a problem for the Republican Party because, Fox News is terrified of being outflanked to its right. With the OAN or Newsmax, and Trump these days does criticize Fox News. 4 or 5, up until last year, it was Fox News was the monolith, right? The Republican Party had this one channel propaganda machine that it used to great success. Now it's starting to splinter, and it started splintering after the election with the big lie. Was Fox News going to get behind the big lie? Well, we'll go somewhere else. Trump now, as I said, attacks Fox News from now and then. So I guess the sliver of hope is there is some kind of fracturing over there, but still overwhelmingly. I just wrote a piece this week, about how Rupert Murdoch is a cancer on this country, and we'll never know how many people he killed during COVID. So it remains an incredibly powerful force and dangerous force. And I still wish the White House would kick Fox News out of the briefing room.
I'm still shocked that they haven't pulled their White House hard pass. It's unbelievable to me. One last quick question. Do you have an opinion? I'm not sure you saw it, but one person wants to know if you have an opinion about the new Democratic ad that talks about Biden's good economic news. And that leads to the follow-up question of, do you think advertising is really one of the only ways that Democrats can get their message out in this kind of media environment?
Gosh, I don't know. I haven't seen that, the new ad. Anything that hits on the economy is good. I'm amazed political ads still run on TV, because I don't know who's seeing them. And particularly during the campaign season, I actually think it's really smart to run political ads off season or right now and talk about the infrastructure and talk about bridges are going to be built and highways are going to be built all around upstate New York and everywhere else. when it comes to the campaign, I just have no idea why people buy campaign time on local news. I don't know anyone who watches that stuff anymore. But when you look around, what else are you supposed to do? It's such a fractured environment. So I think word of mouth is still one of the most important. Social media is still one of the most important, and hopefully, you know, Democrats in the next couple of election cycles will really be able to use that and maybe start weaning themselves on TV, which is so expensive. It's the system that's been set up for 50 years, and consultants love it. Everybody makes money off it, but I don't know if it's the most effective. If it is, they should keep using it. And if there's the data to prove, particularly at local races, then absolutely keep using it. I wonder about, like, you know, the New York City market and things like that, though.
Any final thoughts, Eric, before we say goodnight?
Oh gosh, well, yeah. I thanks for having me. I always, like I said, I always love discussing this, and particularly with Democrats, and particularly people who are keyed into this topic, and could, again, I think Democrats can do a much better job reaching out to the local media, to the national media, and taking media criticism seriously, because this, I think right now we're seeing a classic example. Biden does, yes, there are troubles, and you know, everything's not going as expected, but he has good stories to tell. But if the press won't help tell those stories, it becomes very, very frustrating. And I think Biden mentioned that at the press conference yesterday. Just one real quick example, you know, a reporter got up and said, well, COVID and these school lockdowns, and everyone's frustrated. And he said, do you know what percentage of schools are closed right now in the United States, or are open right now in the United States? And he said it real slowly into the microphone. He said, 95%. He said, 95% of schools are open right now. And he was basically saying, how about some context here? So it's just little things like that. So if you have a good story to tell, it's hard if they don't tell the story for you. And so I think Democrats have to get better at maybe working the refs a little bit. But more importantly, I think the press just has to get better and stop being so intimidated by the Republican Party. And stop being afraid to acknowledge if a Democrat has success. Acknowledging a Democrat has success doesn't mean you're part of this, you know, taboo liberal media bias cabal. It just means you're doing honest journalism. And I think that's all the Biden administration wants at this point.
Right. Excellent point. And I think it's really important that we have to be smart consumers and demand accountability too. I really liked your point about that. Thank you so much, Eric. This has been a great conversation. I want to just make sure that everybody knows to please support Eric's work by checking out and subscribing to Press Run. I do. I enjoy it. I look forward to it. Every post.
Same here.
Yeah, so does Tom. So thank you so much. We're so honored to have you here tonight. Also, please consider donating to us, No Surrender New York. The donation link should be there in the chat. I want to, again, thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful night. Stay warm, be safe, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Much
Thanks, my
appreciated.
pleasure.
Bye-bye. Good
Night,
night, everybody.
everybody.